Elena wiped down the same table for the third time. Not because it was dirty, but because standing still meant someone would find something else for her to do. And tonight, she was already running on empty. The restaurant was called Le Magnifique. Fancy name. Fancy place. The kind of place where a single bottle of wine cost more than Elena made in a whole week. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, white tablecloths covered every table, and the guests who walked through those doors never once looked at the people serving them. Elena had worked here for almost 2 years now. She knew how to smile when she didn't feel like smiling. She knew how to say, "Yes, sir," and "Of course, ma'am," even when every part of her wanted to walk out and never come back. But she couldn't walk out. She had bills to pay. Big ones. The kind that kept her up at night staring at the ceiling. Her mother was sick. Had been sick for 3 years now. The doctors said she needed a special treatment that insurance wouldn't cover. So Elena worked. Morning shifts at a coffee shop. Night shifts here. Sometimes she slept 4 hours, sometimes less. But she never complained. Because complaining didn't pay bills. Tonight was going to be a long one. She could already tell. A private party had taken over the entire back section of the restaurant. 20 guests. All of them rich. All of them loud. And at the center of it all sat a man Elena had heard about, but never seen up close until now. His name was Richard Thornton III. Yes, the third. He made sure everyone knew that. He owned half the buildings in the city. Hotels, shopping malls, apartment complexes. The man was worth hundreds of millions of dollars. And from what Elena had seen in the past hour, he loved making sure everyone remembered it. He snapped his fingers at the waiters like they were dogs. He sent back his steak twice because it wasn't cooked exactly right. He made one of the younger servers almost cry when he called her slow in front of everyone. The other guests laughed like it was the funniest thing they had ever heard. Elena kept her distance. She served the tables near the edges of the group, refilled water glasses, cleared empty plates. She moved quietly, hoping to stay invisible. But in places like this, invisible never lasts long. It happened around 9:30. Elena was carrying a tray with 3 glasses of red wine. Expensive red wine. The kind that came from some vineyard in France and had a name she couldn't pronounce. She moved carefully between the chairs, her eyes focused on the path ahead. Then someone pulled their chair back without looking. The tray tilted. Elena caught it just in time. But one of the glasses wobbled. A few drops of wine splashed out. Just a few drops. They landed on the white tablecloth near Richard Thornton's sleeve. Not on his sleeve. Near it. But that was enough. The whole table went quiet. Richard looked down at the tiny red spots on the tablecloth. Then he looked up at Elena. His eyes were cold. The kind of cold that made you want to step back. But Elena didn't step back. She stood there, holding her tray, waiting for whatever was coming. "Do you have any idea?" Richard said slowly. "How much this suit costs?" Elena opened her mouth to apologize. But before she could speak, Richard raised his hand to stop her. $15,000. He let the number hang in the air. "This suit costs $15,000. And you just tried to ruin it with your cheap wine." "Sir, I am so sorry," Elena said. Her voice was calm, even though her heart was pounding. "The wine didn't touch your suit, but I can get the tablecloth changed right away and bring you a fresh glass on the house." Richard laughed. Not a real laugh. The kind of laugh that was meant to make someone feel small. "On the house," he repeated, looking at his guests. "Did you hear that? She wants to give me something on the house. As if that makes up for her carelessness." A few of the guests chuckled. Others looked uncomfortable but said nothing. Nobody was going to stand up to Richard Thornton. Not here. Not anywhere. Elena felt her face getting hot. But she kept her expression neutral. She had dealt with difficult customers before. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to make her feel like nothing. Just smile, just apologize, just get through it. But Richard wasn't done. He leaned back in his chair and looked at Elena like he was studying her. Like she was some kind of puzzle he wanted to figure out. Then his eyes drifted to the corner of the room, where a beautiful grand piano sat near the window. Nobody ever played it. It was just there for decoration, to make the restaurant look even fancier than it already was. A slow smile spread across Richard's face. The kind of smile that made Elena's stomach turn. "Tell you what," he said. "I'm feeling generous tonight. I'll forgive this whole mess. I won't call your manager. I won't make a scene. But you have to do something for me first." Elena didn't like where this was going. "What do you mean, sir?" Richard pointed at the piano. "Play something for us." The table erupted in laughter. Real laughter this time. The kind that came from watching someone get cornered with nowhere to go. "Surely a waitress can do something besides carry plates." Richard continued. "Entertain us. Give us a little show. Play the piano. And we'll call it even." Elena stared at him. Her mind was racing. She knew what this was. This wasn't about the wine. This wasn't about making things right. This was about power. Richard wanted to watch her fail. He wanted to see her sit at that piano and embarrass herself in front of all these people. He wanted to remind everyone in this room who was at the top and who was at the bottom. One of the guests had already pulled out his phone and was recording. Others followed. Within seconds, half the table had their cameras pointed at Elena. She looked toward the kitchen, hoping her manager would step in. But when she spotted him near the door, he just gave her a small nod. His face said everything. "Just do it. Don't make trouble. We can't afford to lose customers like this." Elena felt something break inside her. Not her spirit. Something else. Something she had kept locked away for a very long time. She looked at Richard. He was grinning now, waiting for her to stumble over her words, waiting for her to beg, waiting for her to prove that she was exactly what he thought she was. Nothing. But Elena didn't beg. She didn't argue. She didn't even speak. She just set her tray down on an empty table, straightened her apron, and walked toward the piano. The room got quiet. People exchanged confused looks. They had expected tears. They had expected panic. They had expected her to refuse and run away. Instead, she pulled out the bench and sat down. Her fingers hovered over the keys. They were shaking, not from fear, from something else. Something she hadn't felt in 7 years. Elena took a deep breath, and then she played the first note. What happened next would change her life forever. The first note hit the air like a whisper. Soft, gentle, almost uncertain. Richard Thornton leaned forward in his chair, already preparing his next insult. His lips curled into a smirk. This was going to be good. This was going to be exactly what he wanted. Some clumsy waitress banging on keys she didn't understand, making a fool of herself while everyone watched. But then came the second note, and the third, and the fourth, and suddenly, the smirk on Richard's face began to fade. Elena's fingers moved across the keys like water flowing over stones. Smooth. Natural. Like they belonged there. Like they had always belonged there. The notes connected into a melody that filled every corner of the room. It wasn't random. It wasn't messy. It was beautiful. She was playing Chopin. One of the most difficult pieces ever written for piano. The kind of piece that took years to master. The kind of piece that professional musicians practiced for months before performing in front of anyone. And this waitress in her worn black uniform was playing it like she had been born with the music already inside her. The laughter died. The whispers stopped. Every single person in that room froze where they were. Champagne glasses hung in midair. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. Even the servers standing near the kitchen doors stopped moving and stared. Richard's face went through a dozen expressions in the span of 10 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, shock, and then something he rarely ever felt. Something that looked almost like fear, because this wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't the script he had written in his head. The waitress was supposed to fail. She was supposed to cry. She was supposed to prove that people like her were beneath people like him. Instead, she was proving something else entirely. The music grew stronger. Elena's eyes were closed now. Her body swayed gently with the rhythm. It was like she had forgotten where she was. Forgotten the cameras. Forgotten the cruel man who had tried to break her. Forgotten everything except the keys beneath her fingers and the melody pouring out of her soul. One of the women at Richard's table put her hand over her mouth. Her eyes were wet. She didn't even know why she was crying. The music just reached inside her chest and pulled something out, something she didn't know was there. An older man near the window set down his wine glass and just listened. He had been to concert halls all over the world. Vienna, Paris, New York. He had heard the greatest pianists of his generation perform on the grandest stages. And yet somehow, this performance in a restaurant, by a woman in a waitress uniform, was hitting him harder than any of them ever had. Because there was something in the way Elena played that couldn't be taught. Something raw. Something real. It wasn't just skill. It was pain. It was longing. It was every struggle she had ever faced being poured into every single note. The piece built to its climax. Elena's fingers flew across the keys faster and faster. The melody twisted and turned, rising and falling like waves crashing against rocks. It was powerful. It was heartbreaking. It was the kind of music that made you forget to breathe. And then, just like that, it was over. The final note hung in the air for what felt like forever. Soft. Quiet. Like the last ray of sunlight before the dark, Elena's hands rested on the keys. She didn't move. She didn't open her eyes. For a moment, she wasn't even sure where she was anymore. The music had taken her somewhere else, somewhere she hadn't been in a very long time. The silence in the room was absolute. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. It was like everyone was afraid that making a sound would break whatever spell had just been cast. Then someone started clapping. It was the older man by the window. He stood up from his chair and applauded like he was at Carnegie Hall. Real applause. The kind that comes from deep appreciation. The kind you can't fake. Another person joined. Then another. Then the whole room. Within seconds, every single guest was on their feet. The applause thundered through the restaurant. People were cheering. Some were wiping their eyes. Others just stood there, shaking their heads in disbelief at what they had just witnessed. Elena finally opened her eyes. She looked out at the crowd, and for a moment, she didn't understand what was happening. These were the same people who had laughed at her 5 minutes ago. The same people who had watched Richard try to humiliate her without saying a word. And now they were applauding like she had just given the performance of a lifetime. She turned to look at Richard Thornton. He was still sitting in his chair. He wasn't clapping. His face had gone pale. His jaw was tight. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire plan collapse in front of him, because he had wanted to destroy her. He had wanted to remind everyone in this room that money and power were all that mattered. That people like Elena were just background noise, just servants, just nothing. But instead, she had reminded everyone of something else. That talent doesn't care about your bank account. That beauty can come from the most unexpected places. That sometimes, the people you look down on are carrying gifts you could never imagine. Elena stood up from the piano bench. Her legs felt weak. Her hands were still trembling. But she held her head high as she walked back toward the kitchen. She didn't say anything to Richard as she passed him. She didn't need to. The look on his face said everything. But before she could reach the kitchen doors, a woman stepped into her path. The woman was in her 60s, dressed in an elegant black dress with silver jewelry. Her hair was gray and pulled back in a neat bun. She had kind eyes, the kind of eyes that had seen a lot of life and understood more than most people ever would. Elena recognized her from the party. She had been sitting at the far end of Richard's table, quiet the whole night, watching everything but saying nothing. That was extraordinary, the woman said softly. Her voice was calm but serious. Where did you study? Elena hesitated. Nobody had asked her that question in years. She had trained herself to never talk about it, to never think about it, because thinking about it hurt too much. Juilliard, Elena finally said. A long time ago. The woman's eyes widened just slightly. Juilliard. One of the most prestigious music schools in the entire world. The kind of place that only accepted the best of the best. Why did you stop? The woman asked. Elena felt her throat tighten. She didn't want to answer. She didn't want to explain. She didn't want to open that door again. Life happened, she said quietly. Sometimes we don't get to choose our path. The woman studied her for a long moment. Then she reached into her purse and pulled out a small card. She held it out to Elena. My name is Margaret Chen, she said. I'm a producer. Classical music. I've spent 40 years finding talent and putting it on stages around the world. Elena took the card. Her hands were shaking again. What happened tonight wasn't an accident, Margaret continued. I've seen hundreds of pianists, maybe thousands, but I've only seen a handful who play the way you do, with that kind of soul. Elena didn't know what to say. Her mind was spinning. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. She was a waitress. She served food and cleared tables. She wasn't supposed to be standing here holding a card from one of the most important people in the music industry. Margaret smiled gently. I don't know what happened to you. I don't know why you gave it up. But whatever it was, I think you've been hiding for too long. She placed a hand on Elena's shoulder. Call me when you're ready. Then she turned and walked back to her table, leaving Elena standing alone near the kitchen doors, holding a small white card that felt heavier than anything she had ever carried. Behind her, the applause had finally faded. The guests were returning to their seats. The buzz of conversation was starting to fill the room again, but Elena didn't hear any of it. She was somewhere else, somewhere in the past, somewhere she had promised herself she would never go again, because Margaret was right. Elena had been hiding, and now, the question she had been avoiding for 7 years was staring her right in the face. Why? Elena didn't sleep that night. She lay in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the city outside her window. Cars passing, sirens in the distance. The hum of the building's old heating system, but none of it reached her. Not really. Her mind was somewhere else. Somewhere, far away. Somewhere, she had tried so hard to forget. The card from Margaret Chen sat on her nightstand. She had looked at it 100 times since coming home. The letters were simple. A name, a phone number, a company logo, but to Elena, it felt like a door. A door she had locked 7 years ago and sworn never to open again. But tonight, that door was cracking open whether she wanted it to or not. She closed her eyes, and the memories came flooding back. Elena was 5 years old the first time she touched a piano. It was at her grandmother's house. An old upright piano sat in the corner of the living room. It was out of tune and missing a few keys. But to little Elena, it was the most magical thing she had ever seen. She walked up to it while the adults were talking in the kitchen. She pressed one key, then another, and something inside her clicked into place, like finding a piece of yourself you didn't know was missing. Her father found her there an hour later, still playing. Not songs, not melodies, just sounds. But even then, there was something special about the way she touched those keys, something that made him stop in the doorway and just watch. Her father was a construction worker. Big hands, rough skin. He had never played an instrument in his life. But he knew his daughter had something. He could feel it. The next week, he signed her up for piano lessons. They couldn't afford much. The lessons were cheap, once a week, at a community center downtown. The piano there was old and worn, just like the one at her grandmother's house. But Elena didn't care. She loved every second of it. By the time she was 8, her teacher said there was nothing left to teach her. She had outgrown everything the community center could offer. She needed a real instructor. A professional. Her father worked overtime for 6 months to pay for better lessons. He picked up extra shifts on weekends. He gave up his one day off so his daughter could learn from someone who could match her talent. He never complained, not once, and Elena grew. She grew fast. By 12, she was winning competitions. Local ones at first, then state, then national. People started to notice. Music critics wrote about her. Teachers from famous schools came to watch her perform. They used words like prodigy and once in a generation. At 14, she received a letter that changed everything. An acceptance letter from Juilliard. Full scholarship. One of the youngest students ever admitted to their program. Her father cried when he read it. He held her so tight she could barely breathe. He kept saying the same thing over and over. I knew it. I always knew it. Elena moved to New York 2 months later. She was scared and excited and overwhelmed all at once. But every time she sat at a piano, the fear went away. The music was her home. No matter where she was, no matter how far from her family, the music always made her feel safe. The years at Juilliard were the happiest of her life. She practiced for hours every day. She learned from masters who had performed on the greatest stages in the world. She made friends who loved music as much as she did. And she dreamed of the day she would perform at Carnegie Hall, with her father sitting in the front row, watching his little girl become everything he always believed she could be. She was 21 when she got the call. It was a Tuesday afternoon. She was in a practice room, working on a new piece for her senior recital. Her phone buzzed. She almost didn't answer, but something told her to pick it up. It was her mother. Her father had collapsed at work, a heart attack. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. He was gone. Elena flew home that night. She didn't cry on the plane. She didn't cry at the airport. She didn't cry when she saw her mother standing alone in the living room, looking smaller than she had ever looked before. She cried at the funeral, when they lowered his coffin into the ground, when she realized she would never hear his voice again, never feel his arms around her, never see the proud look in his eyes when she played. He had given up everything for her dream. And now he was gone, before he could see it come true. 2 months later, things got worse. Her mother started forgetting things. Small things at first. Where she put her keys, what day it was. But then the forgetting got bigger. She forgot to pay bills, forgot to eat, forgot the names of people she had known for years. The doctors ran tests. Lots of tests. The diagnosis came back like a punch to the gut. A degenerative condition. The kind that would only get worse with time. The kind that needed constant care and expensive treatments that insurance refused to cover. Elena had a choice to make. She could stay at Juilliard, finish her degree, pursue her dream, and hope that somehow, from far away, she could find a way to take care of her mother. Or she could go home. She went home. She withdrew from school 3 weeks before her senior recital. She sold her piano. The beautiful grand piano her father had saved for years to buy her for her 18th birthday. She sold it to pay for the first round of her mother's treatment. And then she started working. She took any job she could find. Retail, cleaning, food service, whatever paid the bills. She worked mornings and nights, sometimes double shifts, sometimes back to back to back with barely any rest. She stopped playing. Completely. At first, it was just because she didn't have time. There was always another shift, another bill, another treatment to pay for. But after a while, it became something else. The music reminded her of everything she had lost. Her father, her future, the life she was supposed to have. Every time she heard a piano, she felt like someone was reaching into her chest and squeezing her heart. So, she stopped listening. Stopped thinking about it. Stopped allowing herself to miss it. She locked that part of herself away and threw away the key. 7 years passed. 7 years of silence. 7 years of pretending that chapter of her life never existed. 7 years of telling herself that she was fine. That this was enough. That she didn't need the music anymore. But standing in that restaurant tonight, sitting at that piano, feeling the keys beneath her fingers for the first time in so long, Elena realized something she had been running from all along. The music had never left her. It was still there. Buried deep. Waiting. Patient. Like an old friend who never gave up. No matter how many times you pushed them away. And now Margaret Chen was offering her a chance to bring it back. But Elena was terrified. Because going back meant opening all the wounds she had worked so hard to close. It meant remembering her father. Remembering the dream they shared. Remembering the night she gave it all up. It meant admitting that the last 7 years, all the sacrifices, all the silence, maybe it didn't have to be that way. And that was the hardest thing of all. Elena turned on her side and looked at the card one more time. She thought about her mother, sleeping in the next room, getting weaker every year. She thought about her father, who gave up everything so she could have a chance. And she thought about the little girl who fell in love with an out-of-tune piano in her grandmother's living room. That little girl was still in there somewhere. Maybe it was time to let her out. Elena made the call 3 days later. Her hands were shaking when she dialed the number. Her heart was pounding so loud she could hear it in her ears. Part of her hoped Margaret wouldn't answer. Part of her hoped this whole thing would just fade away like a strange dream. But Margaret answered on the second ring. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said. Her voice was warm, patient, like she had been waiting by the phone the whole time. They met at a coffee shop downtown the next afternoon. Margaret was already there when Elena arrived, sitting at a corner table with a cup of tea and a calm smile. She didn't waste time with small talk. "I've been in this industry for 40 years, Margaret said. "I've seen talent come and go. Some people have skill. Some people have technique. But very few people have what you have." Elena looked down at her hands. "I haven't played seriously in 7 years. I'm not the same person I was." "No," Margaret agreed. "You're better." Elena looked up, confused. Margaret leaned forward. "When you were young, you played with skill. That night at the restaurant, you played with soul. Pain does that to people. It deepens them. It gives their art something that practice alone can never provide." She pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. "I want to organize a comeback concert for you. One night, one performance. Carnegie Hall." Elena's breath caught in her throat. Carnegie Hall. The stage she had dreamed about since she was a little girl. The stage her father had always said he would sit in the front row to watch her perform on. "I can't afford something like that," Elena said quietly. "I can barely afford my rent." Margaret shook her head. "I'll handle everything. The venue, the promotion, the production, all of it. This will be fully sponsored, and every penny from ticket sales will go directly to your mother's treatment." Elena stared at her. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. Not anymore. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this for me?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled, but there was something sad behind it. "Because 40 years ago, I was you," she said. "I was young. I was talented. And I let fear stop me from becoming what I was meant to be. I've spent my whole career helping others reach the stage I was too afraid to stand on myself." She reached across the table and placed her hand over Elena's. "Don't make the same mistake I did. Don't let the fear win." Elena didn't say yes right away. She went home and sat with her mother, watching her sleep. She thought about everything she had given up, everything she had lost, everything she was afraid of. And then she thought about her father. About the way he used to smile when she played. About the way he believed in her even when she didn't believe in herself. The next morning, she called Margaret. "I'll do it." The news spread fast. Within a week, the video from the restaurant had gone viral. Someone at Richard's party had posted it online. And it exploded. Millions of views. Thousands of comments. People from all over the world were sharing Elena's story. The waitress, who stunned a room full of millionaires. The hidden genius who had been serving tables while carrying a gift most people could only dream of. News outlets picked it up. Morning shows, online magazines. Everyone wanted to talk about Elena. Everyone wanted to know her story, and Richard Thornton watched it all unfold with fury burning in his chest. He had never been humiliated like that in his life. He was Richard Thornton III. He owned buildings. He owned businesses. He owned people. And now, everywhere he went, people were whispering about the waitress who made him look like a fool. His reputation was taking hits. Business partners were making jokes behind his back. Investors were questioning his judgment. All because of one woman with a piano. Richard couldn't let it stand. He picked up his phone and started making calls. The first call was to the owner of Le Magnifique. By the end of the conversation, Elena was fired. No reason given. Just a cold message that her services were no longer needed. The second call was to a friend who sat on the board of Carnegie Hall. Richard made it clear that if Elena's concert moved forward, certain donations might be reconsidered. Certain partnerships might be reviewed. The third call was to a journalist he had in his pocket, a man who owed Richard favors and wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty. Within days, stories started appearing online. Anonymous sources claiming Elena had lied about her background. Rumors that she had been kicked out of Juilliard for bad behavior. Whispers that the whole restaurant performance had been staged for attention. None of it was true. But truth didn't matter to Richard. Perception mattered. And he was going to make sure the world saw Elena as a fraud. Margaret called Elena on a Thursday night. Her voice was heavy. "We have a problem." She explained everything. The pressure on Carnegie Hall, the smear campaign, the stories spreading online. Richard Thornton was using every weapon he had to destroy Elena before she even had a chance to begin. Elena sat in silence for a long time after the call ended. She thought about giving up. It would be so easy. Just walk away. Go back to the shadows. Find another job. Pretend none of this ever happened. That was what Richard wanted. He wanted her to disappear. He wanted to prove that people like her could never rise above their place. He wanted to crush her so completely that no one would ever remember her name. But then Elena thought about all the messages she had received over the past week, thousands of them, from people all over the world. People who had watched her video and felt something. A single mother who said Elena's story gave her hope. A teenager who had given up on his dreams and was now reconsidering. An elderly man who said he cried for the first time in years watching her play. These people didn't care about Richard Thornton. They didn't care about money or power or fancy suits. They cared about something real, something true, something that couldn't be bought or destroyed. Elena realized she wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been made to feel small. Everyone who had ever been told they weren't good enough. Everyone who had ever buried their dreams because the world said they didn't deserve them. She picked up her phone and called Margaret. "I'm not backing down." Margaret let out a breath of relief. "Good, because neither am I." They made a plan. They couldn't fight Richard's money. They couldn't match his connections. But they had something he didn't have. They had the people. Margaret reached out to every musician she knew. Every artist. Every performer who had ever struggled against a system designed to keep them down. And one by one, they answered. Famous pianists offered to promote Elena's concert. Orchestras volunteered to perform with her for free. Composers sent messages of support. The classical music world, a world Elena thought had forgotten her, was rallying behind her like an army, and the public kept sharing her story, kept watching her video, kept demanding that she get her chance. Richard's smear campaign started to backfire. People saw through the lies. They recognized the pattern. A rich man trying to silence a woman who had embarrassed him. It was a story as old as time, and this time, people weren't going to let the rich man win. The pressure on Carnegie Hall lifted. The board decided that canceling Elena's concert would cause more damage than hosting it. The show would go on. When Elena heard the news, she didn't celebrate. She didn't cheer. She just sat quietly in her apartment, looking out the window at the city lights. In 3 weeks, she would stand on the stage she had dreamed about her entire life. In 3 weeks, she would either rise or fall in front of the whole world. And somewhere out there, Richard Thornton was watching, waiting, planning his next move. But Elena wasn't afraid anymore. She had spent 7 years hiding from her gift. 7 years running from who she was meant to be. Not anymore. This time, she was ready to fight. The night had finally arrived. Elena stood backstage at Carnegie Hall, her hands pressed against the cold wall to steady herself. She could hear the crowd on the other side. Thousands of people, filling every seat, standing in the aisles, waiting for her. 3 weeks ago, she had been a waitress carrying plates and wiping down tables. Tonight, she was about to walk onto the most famous stage in the world. Her dress was simple, black, elegant. Margaret had offered to buy her something expensive, something designer, but Elena said no. She didn't want to pretend to be something she wasn't. She was still the same woman who worked double shifts to pay her mother's medical bills. The same woman who had sacrificed everything for the people she loved. The only difference was that tonight, she was finally going to play again. A stagehand approached her with a gentle smile. 5 minutes, Miss Vasquez. Elena nodded. Her throat was too tight to speak. She thought about running. The exit was right there. She could disappear into the New York night and pretend none of this ever happened. Go back to the shadows, where it was safe. Where no one expected anything from her. Where she couldn't fail. But then she thought about the woman sitting in the front row, her mother. It had taken everything to get her here tonight. The doctors said she wasn't strong enough to travel. But Elena's mother had insisted. She had looked at her daughter with those tired, loving eyes and said, "I'm not missing this. Not for anything in the world." So they made it work. A wheelchair. A nurse by her side. A seat right in the center of the front row, where she could see everything. Her mother hadn't watched her perform since Elena was 18 years old. Since before her father died. Since before everything fell apart. Tonight, she would finally see her daughter on the stage she was always meant to stand on. Elena couldn't run. Not now. Not after everything. She took a deep breath and stepped toward the curtain. The walk from backstage to the piano felt like the longest walk of her life. The lights were bright. The audience was silent. Every step echoed through the massive hall like a heartbeat. She didn't look at the crowd. Not yet. She kept her eyes on the piano. The beautiful grand piano sitting in the center of the stage, waiting for her like an old friend. When she finally sat down on the bench, she allowed herself one moment to look out at the audience. And there, in the front row, was her mother. She looked so small in that wheelchair, so fragile. But she was smiling, a real smile, the kind Elena hadn't seen in years, the kind that said everything words could never express. Elena felt tears building behind her eyes. But she didn't let them fall. Not yet. She turned back to the piano and placed her fingers on the keys. The hall went completely silent. Not a cough. Not a whisper. Not a single sound. And then she began to play. The first piece was Chopin. The same piece she had played in the restaurant that night. But this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't playing to prove anything to anyone. She wasn't playing to survive. She wasn't playing to escape. She was playing because she loved it. The music filled the hall like water filling a vessel. It reached into every corner, every seat, every heart. People who had never listened to classical music before felt something stirring inside them. Something they couldn't name but couldn't ignore. Elena played like she had never played before. Every note carried the weight of everything she had been through. The loss of her father. The years of struggle. The silence she had forced upon herself, the fear, the pain, the hope. It was all there, in every chord, in every melody, in every breath between the notes. When the first piece ended, the applause was deafening. But Elena didn't stop. She moved into the second piece, then the third, then the fourth. She played for an hour straight. No breaks, no pauses, just music, pure and endless, and alive. By the time she reached the final piece, tears were streaming down her face. She didn't try to hide them. She let them fall onto the keys as her fingers danced across them one last time. The final note rang out through the hall. Soft, gentle, like a whisper goodbye, and then silence. For 3 full seconds, nobody moved. Then the audience erupted. Every single person rose to their feet. The applause was like thunder. People were cheering, crying, holding each other. The sound washed over Elena like a wave, and she finally let herself feel it. She had done it. She looked at her mother. The old woman was crying too, her hands clasped over her heart. She mouthed 3 words that Elena could read even from the stage. "I love you." Elena pressed her hand to her own heart and mouthed the words back. The standing ovation lasted 11 minutes. 11 minutes of applause that never stopped, never faded, never wavered. People didn't want to leave. They didn't want the moment to end. They wanted to hold on to it forever. When Elena finally stood and took her bow, she noticed something strange. In the very back of the hall, standing alone near the exit, was a familiar figure. Richard Thornton. He wasn't clapping. He wasn't smiling. He just stood there, watching. His face was unreadable. But he hadn't left. He had stayed for the entire performance. Elena didn't know what to feel. Anger. Confusion. Something else she couldn't name. After the concert, she went backstage to find her mother and Margaret waiting for her. There were hugs. There were tears. There were words that meant everything and nothing all at once. But then a stagehand approached with an envelope. "Someone left this for you," he said. A man. He didn't leave his name. Elena took the envelope. It was thick, heavy. She opened it carefully. Inside was a check. A very large check. Enough to cover her mother's treatment for the next 5 years. Maybe more. There was no note. No signature. Just the check. But Elena knew who it was from. She stood there for a long time, staring at the numbers on that piece of paper. Part of her wanted to tear it up. Part of her wanted to throw it away and never think about Richard Thornton again. But then she looked at her mother, sitting in that wheelchair. Looking more tired than ever, but happier than she had been in years. Elena folded the check and put it in her pocket. An hour later, as she was leaving the building, she saw him. Richard was standing outside, near a black car. He looked different than he had at the restaurant. Smaller somehow. Less sure of himself. Elena walked up to him. She didn't yell. She didn't curse. She just looked him in the eye. "This doesn't make us even," she said quietly. Richard nodded slowly. He didn't argue. He didn't make excuses. "I know," he said. His voice was rough, tired. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I've spent my whole life believing that money made me better than everyone else. That power was all that mattered." He looked at her, and for the first time, there was something human in his eyes. "You proved me wrong, in front of everyone, and I hated you for it." Elena said nothing. She just waited. "But tonight," Richard continued, "watching you play, I understood something I never understood before." He shook his head slowly. "There are things in this world that money can't buy. Things that power can't touch. And you have them. I never will." He turned and walked toward his car. Before he got in, he looked back one last time. "For what it's worth," he said. "Your father would have been proud." Then he was gone. Elena stood alone on the sidewalk, the cold night air brushing against her face. She thought about everything that had led to this moment. Every struggle. Every sacrifice. Every note she had ever played. And she realized something. This wasn't an ending. This was a beginning. She had spent 7 years in the dark. 7 years hiding from who she was. 7 years believing that her dreams were dead. But dreams don't die. They just wait. Patient and quiet. Until you're ready to wake up again. Elena looked up at the stars above the city. Somewhere up there, she knew her father was watching, and she knew he was smiling.